Susan May is a convicted murderess. She spent 12 years in some of the toughest prisons in Britain and rubbed shoulders with the likes of Rose West and Myra Hindley.
She would sometimes seek me out and say what was going on. And I've got to admit, the hairs on the back of my neck used to stand up when Myra did speak to me. And I don't think I'd have survived prison if I'd have dwelt on who I was rubbing shoulders with.
But should Susan have been in prison in the first place? Or has an innocent woman been convicted of a crime she did not commit? On the 11th of March 1992, a brutal murder occurred in a picturesque part of the northwest. 89-year-old Hilda Marchbank lived on the road leading up to Tandle Hill Park in Royton, just outside Rochdale. Sometime after 9 o'clock that night, somebody entered her house through the back door, which had been left unlocked. They walked through the kitchen, towards the downstairs bedroom where she was resting in a single bed. The house was ransacked, and Hilda was brutally beaten, stripped, and suffocated.
Auntie was lovely. She was a very kind person, very naive person, I would say. Throughout all my life, because she'd never had children, I think I looked on her as a second mum. Her and Mum were always very close. I never remember a time in my life when Auntie wasn't always there. I used to stay with her as a little girl. I'm very family orientated and couldn't bear not to see my mum and dad every day, even after I'd got married. I saw Auntie every day, and it was something I wanted to do. It was a pleasure.
She loved going up there, and she looked after me Auntie. You never heard a cross word because she just, it wasn't even a duty. It was just something that she did. She loved doing it. I
could go to see Auntie, and by the time I'd driven down, which is only a short distance from Tandle Road to here, and park the car, come in, and the phone would be ringing, and I'd smile and think, this'll be Auntie, and it would, and she'd say, am I not seeing you today? And I'd say, I've just left you, and I've left you tea there, or I've left you lunch there, whatever time of day it was, and she'd say, oh, I'm a fool, I'm sorry, love. And I said, don't worry, no problem.
Susan visited Hilda Marchbank's house at around 9 p.m. on the night of the murder. She made an uncharacteristically late visit because Hilda had lost her front door keys.
Normally, I wouldn't go maybe after 4, 4:30. About 3 times a week, or even more, she'd come down here to have tea with us. On that evening, the phone rang and it was Auntie, and she said, where do you think my front door keys are? Now, I tried to teach her to leave her keys on the shelf in the porch because once her keys were in the door, my keys wouldn't go in. And so that was a new thing to her, and she had not remembered it. So I said, well, don't bother, Auntie. Your front door keys are on the ledge, but don't open your front door in an evening. All right, love, see you tomorrow. And she phoned again, where are my front door keys now? And I then thought, what's happening here? So I went up to Auntie's. She was ready for bed, and I said, what's happening? And she said, I don't know, what have you come for? She'd even forgotten. And I said, well, you asked, and I took her through the hall. I said, see, these are your keys, Auntie, but you must never open your door. She went, no, all right then. And I stayed 5-10 minutes, if that. And I said, now, I'll see you in the morning, as usual. She said, right, love. Kissed her goodbye. And the last, memory then is she was stood waving me off.
After visiting Hilda's house, Susan then picked her boyfriend up and took him and his friend to the pub. Arriving home, she made a few phone calls, chatted to her daughter Katie, and then went to bed. The next morning, Susan visited the local shops to buy her aunt a sandwich before driving the short distance to Hilda's house.
Something I did every day, every single day. I went up to Auntie's, walked in through that door, and I just thought it would be a normal day.
Auntie? Auntie? Auntie?
And so I left my handbag on one side and must have put the things I bought her for lunch on the other unit and pushed the door to, well, I'll call it a bedroom. The downstairs door to the bedroom wasn't closed to, it was ajar. And so I pushed that open. And Auntie was lying on the bed, I came across a scene of horror. She was naked from her breast down, something that in the years gone since then has bothered me terribly because she was such a private person, and I just think how awful it was that that's how she was lying. And I remember looking, I must have gone up to the side of the bed because my real strong vision still is of being right over the top of her, and I don't know whether I touched her or whether I didn't touch her or what, because I cannot remember coming out of the house. I came across a scene of horror, and my next vision of remembering where I was stood on the driveway outside Auntie's thinking I've got to get some help. I cannot remember fully what I did in those seconds when I found her.
It was total shock. It was beyond. There were no tears or anything. It was past that. It was. She looked like horrendous, and she couldn't tell me what had happened because she said it's too bad. You'll not believe it. You'll not believe what's happened, and she was just in total shock.
Oldham police were on the scene in minutes, interviewing witnesses, taking photographs and removing forensic evidence, including footprints and fibres from the scene. A neighbour had seen a suspicious-looking red car, possibly a Ford Fiesta, outside the house at around midnight. There was no one inside, the lights were off and the engine was running. He noticed it was there for around 15 minutes. Another neighbour had spotted the car earlier that night and gave a detailed description of it to the police, as he thought the three men inside were up to no good. He also described the car as a red Ford Fiesta and added that it had a sloping back bumper. Immediately, the police focused their efforts into tracing this car and its suspicious occupants.
There were 3 people in the car, and he gave reasonable descriptions of those 3 people to the police, and a very good description of the car as well. I believe that car carried the people who did the murder.
The sightings of this red car being parked on the wrong side of the road, as it were, with the engine running at that late stage in the evening, you think that's really suspicious. And so I trusted that the police would keep looking for that.
Along with the sighting of the red car, other pieces of evidence were collected from the crime scene.
In the initial investigation, the forensic teams found a number of fingerprints that were never identified to anyone that we know about. There was a number of footmarks in the porch and a footmark even in a wardrobe upstairs that was never identified to anyone. The most significant find that was never identified to anyone were clothing fibres which were found on the hand of the dead lady. The police checked if they belonged to any of her clothes or Susan's clothes, but they were not identified with her. And if they're on her hand, they must belong to someone else who did the murder.
For the next few weeks, the murder hunt was intense. The search for the driver of the red car and his possible accomplices was centre stage, and during this the police kept in daily contact with Susan and her immediate family, taking witness statements from her children and her sister. Hilda Marchbank's murder had sparked outrage in this close-knit community, but nobody was prepared for what was to happen next. Halfway through the investigation, the police had called off their search for the occupants of the red car, and without her knowledge, started to build a case against Susan. 19 days after the murder, the police turned up on her doorstep and arrested Susan May for the murder of her aunt.
Susan May.
Suddenly, bang, my mum gets arrested, and you just sort of shut down, sort of thing. It's really hard to describe. It was too much. It was like emotional overload, to be honest with you. I couldn't really cope with it all.
When they came to arrest me on the 30th, I found Auntie on the morning of the 12th of March, and when they came to arrest me on the 30th, so all that time had passed, I'd seen the police every day, and I was so shocked when I opened the front door. I didn't realise that they suspected me.
with hindsight, you could see it coming. They scaled everything down up at the house and they were here all the time. The way they were wording it, oh, we're just trying to find out, we're only trying to help you, Susan, and get to the bottom of everything, and we want to find out who's killed my auntie. But looking back, they were just setting it up. You'd expect a bit of a backlash. It's a terrible crime that happened to my auntie. She was beaten badly, strangled, suffocated, whatever else it was that was happened to her. And then my mum gets arrested. The way the world is these days, and was in the early 90s, you'd expect the windows in, wouldn't you, in the house, and no, all it was people on the phone, people coming to the door and saying, this is unbelievable.
So why did the police make Susan their chief suspect and build their case against her? Unbeknownst to Susan, suspicion was raised by her own sister, Anne.
I think Susan's worst enemy was her own sister.
My sister, I think, was the first to put doubts with the police.
Her sister had an alcohol problem, but it was nobody was supposed to know. But Sue, of course, knew, because she quite often had to go around to the house and help her sister who was fighting with her husband. It
was almost like they had two lifestyles. The lifestyle they wanted people to see, and then this other terrible lifestyle where maybe Jerry handled it better, but Anne was terrible, terrible alcoholic. One of the first things she told the police was that I'd stopped her going to see Auntie, per se, any time, which is rubbish, absolute rubbish. But Anne had stopped helping to look after Auntie. She didn't really come and see Mum a lot because she couldn't really look after herself because of her alcoholism. But they told the police that. Now, alarm bells must have rung with Oldham Police at that time, because the police said to me, in the first couple of days, the neighbours say only one niece goes to visit Auntie a lot, and that's you. Why doesn't your sister go? I didn't say, well, my sister's a raging alcoholic. I said, oh, she's not been very well recently, so I've took a lot of it on. I'm doing it all myself. And so I covered for Anne then. But when they went to say to Anne, the neighbours say only Susan goes to visit Auntie, she said, yeah, because Sue stops me going. That was a barefaced lie. I mean, I know since she regretted that because she died when I was in prison. But the police used her. There is evidence from people who deal with alcoholics. My sister should never have been questioned. She should never have been used as a witness at my trial, a prosecution witness, because she didn't know what she was doing or saying.
Locked away in the holding cells at the local police station, Susan was left alone to try to come to terms with why she was being accused of this brutal murder. After the brutal murder of Hilda Marchbank, her niece Susan May found herself chief suspect. And as other lines of inquiry were closed, including the search for the occupants of the red Ford Fiesta, she rapidly understands that in reality, she is the only suspect. The police and prosecution team knew that Susan visited Hilda after 9 p.m. on that fateful night, placing her at the murder scene at a time when the murder could have been committed. The case against her was built around 3 crucial points. The first, their belief that Susan's greed led her to batter her auntie to death for her money. Susan's boyfriend at the time was a man called Chris Ross, who was 15 years younger than her. They kept their relationship secret, as he was still married to one of Susan's friends, although they'd been separated for a few years. The police accused Susan of murdering Hilda in order to financially benefit from the inheritance so that she could lavish money on Chris.
It was suggested that she murdered her aunt so she could get her hands on her aunt's money, but she already had total control by a power of attorney, so that there was nothing extra she needed to do to get control.
Sue had been best friends with Chris and his wife, so she'd fallen, it's the old triangle, she'd fallen in love with their best friend's guy.
The whole business of what she was spending on this relationship was blown out of all proportion to what the reality actually demonstrated.
Susan originally told the police that she wasn't having a relationship with Chris, but this was a lie. And when they found out the truth, they assumed Susan was lying about everything.
They found out that I was seeing Chris Ross, who was a number of years younger than me. And, you know, in times like this, you just think, Well, nobody's going to think about that, because to me it was nothing. It wasn't anything to do with anything, and the fact that he was younger than me didn't mean anything to me. We never considered ages, but sadly the police can make a lot of things like that. Maybe everybody has something in their lives that's nothing and insignificant, but in a situation like I got placed in, it can be made into something seedy and for the jury to look on you, and it blackens your character.
Secondly was a comment that Susan was alleged to have said to a police officer about some scratches on Hilda's face. The police claimed that Susan asked whether they would be able to retrieve evidence from under her fingernails. Susan denies she ever said this, and her daughter Katie took the witness stand to back up everything her mother said.
The officer at that time doing the police interviews threw this in front of me verbally, saying, we believe that you told another detective that you mentioned scratches on your aunt's face. And I said, I've never mentioned scratches on my auntie's face.
And these are the words Susan was alleged to have said.
No, the scratches on my aunt's face will forensics get stuff from down my nails. Now, had I said that, I should have been dragged back in that police station and read my rights right away, because that's a very incriminating statement. B, at that time, the word forensics wasn't really in my vocabulary. And C, if I'd done this terrible thing, am I going to be saying something like that? I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous.
Des Thomas is a former police officer acting as a forensic consultant on Susan's appeal.
The conversation that Susan had inappropriate knowledge of an injury to her aunt, and she had it on, I think, a couple of days after the murder. Well, one would normally expect a conversation of that significance would have made her a suspect straight away, but that doesn't appear to have happened.
The statement regarding the scratches that the police claimed that Susan had made was vehemently, and is vehemently denied by Susan to this day.
I will stand on a rooftop and swear on oath I never said it.
It seemed that once having focused on Susan, they focused on Susan.
The third main side to the prosecution's case was a piece of forensic evidence, a bloody fingerprint belonging to Susan, which the police claimed to have been made at around the time of the murder.
The main plank of the prosecution's case was that there were 3 stains on the wall which they presumed by their tests to be blood. One of the stains was later tested and found to be human blood, and one of the stains had Susan's fingerprint in it. So they put all 3 together and said that those 3 stains were made after Susan had got blood on her hands from killing her aunt at the time of the murder.
Later, it will be revealed how these claims have been proven to be unsubstantiated.
The fingerprint was shown to be fingerprint only after it had been enhanced by some chemicals. But the chemicals had reacted with the original stain to bolden it, like blood might have been, and that would be the stain that was shown to the jury. Originally, the stain was very, very faint.
Well, one of the traps SIOs fall into is they can get mesmerised, like everybody else, by forensic science. And they shouldn't happen. Forensic scientists should actually give them a dispassionate view, and where they don't, an SIO should challenge it.
The police took just over a year to build a case against Susan, and the trial was scheduled for April 1993. They claimed she had bludgeoned her auntie to death in the hope of taking her money, leaving a bloody fingerprint behind as proof. Susan had naively hired her local solicitor to represent her in court, even though he had no prior experience of a murder trial. She didn't believe for 1 minute that she would be found guilty, and saw no reason to hire expensive representation when she fully assumed she would be cleared of all charges.
The original trial was, it weren't farcical, doesn't do it justice really, I don't know the words. It would be beyond belief.
My jury never heard about any other suspect. You know, there were lines of police inquiry that were shut down when they decided to arrest me, but my defence team never put that before the jury.
My mum's quite innocent still, thinking, oh well, British justice, best in the world. It'll just be resolved in a few days.
I could kick myself that I didn't push forward like my original solicitor saying to me in those early days. Let me explain to you, Sue. We can get legal aid for a defence fingerprint expert, defence blood expert, defence time of death expert, all these experts. And he said to me, but we don't need that because you're not going to get convicted. Right, I thought, because I trusted him and I'd not done it, so why did they need these experts? I mean, now, good heavens, going to a murder trial with no defence witnesses at all is ludicrous.
Susan's case was sliding away from her. The jury never heard about the eyewitness testimony to the red car and the unidentified footprints and fibres suggesting the presence of a burglar. The prosecution had painted a picture of a cruel woman, desperate to finance the relationship with a toy boy lover, and the jury accepted it. They accepted that Susan May brutally beat her auntie to death because it appeared to be the only viable answer. No defence witnesses were ever invited to discredit the forensics or testify to Susan's character. On the 5th of May 1993, the damning verdict was handed to the judge.
I had a horrible, sickening feeling that I thought she could go to jail tomorrow.
The usual things said, members of the jury, if you could reach a decision, yes, we have unanimous, yes. And they said guilty. And it was like, I wanted to scream and I couldn't. And I remember I was in this glass box and I remember putting my hands and banging on the glass box saying, you're wrong, you're wrong. And I turned because my family and friends were sat to the back across there beyond this glass box and I shouted, help me, please help me. And the next thing he just said, there's no other sentence I can give you but life sentence and take her down.
It's hard to comprehend life until you start really actually think about it. I thought, she's going to go to prison. She's in prison now, and this is it. Any
minute now they'll realise they've made a mistake. I really, really believed that it would come, you know, that somebody would say, sorry, you know, that was wrong, we've made a big mistake.
In May 1993, Susan May is taken to Risley to start her life sentence.
When I first got convicted and went to Risley prison, I still had that belief. I used to think, I don't know why, I used to got this performance, if you will, that every day about 7:30 new intakes used to come in, and so people used to stand on the landings and watch who's new coming in. And I remember for the first couple of months thinking that within those new intakes would be a face I knew, a family member saying, Mum, you can come home because it's all a big mistake. They've admitted it's a mistake.
She soon realised that nobody was going to come and take her home, and her fate became ever more real. But she was not altogether alone. Back in her hometown of Royton, a group of people, all individually convinced of her innocence, met in a local pub. After carefully reviewing the evidence together, they made a pact to attempt to clear Susan's name.
The organisation that have been supporting her, the Friends of Susan May, have done a wonderful job in highlighting her case.
The Friends of Susan May group formed very quickly after Susan was found guilty. Initially, the activity centred around getting another solicitor who would do a proper job, you know. My relationship with Sue goes back to when we were children. She was my sister's best friend, so she was around the house, you know, during my early years. And known as just a good friend of the family.
As the battle to clear her name gets underway, Susan makes a decision to concentrate on winning an appeal, opening herself up to the possibility of being denied parole.
I did a job of work in the prison. I never refused work, but I refused all prison courses and inverted commas offending behaviour courses, which you're supposed to do. So I refused all those, and it was drummed into me by probation, prison staff that unless I did the courses and unless I admitted guilt, I most probably would never be released.
In 1997, 4 years after Susan's conviction, an appeal was prepared. To be granted an appeal, you need at least one powerful brand new piece of evidence, not available at the time of the original trial. Without this, it is virtually impossible for a judge to allow it to go ahead. But Susan's appeal was rushed and not well enough prepared, and failed to overturn her conviction.
I attended the first appeal as part of our group Innocent, because our group Innocent knew about Sue's case and wanted to show its support.
In all honesty, the first appeal was a right cobbled together affair. We hardly had any belief that it would do the job.
Shortly after the failure of the first appeal, work began on the second appeal. But on the inside, Susan was having a difficult time coping with daily life in some of Britain's toughest prisons.
The main bulk of the time I spent was in Durham Prison, which is a Victorian, very old Victorian prison, and it was absolutely shocking when I first arrived there, because I didn't realise I was actually on H-wing. I thought I was in a reception area. It was a very, very confined, narrow space. I kept myself to myself and chose my friends and who I would spend time with. It was prison, it was a prison environment, but not everybody in prison is bad or awful. There are some really decent people in prison, and I've made some good friends while I've been in prison. Friends who I'm still in touch with, and friends who I'm not sorry I made.
One of Susan's fellow cellmates was Sandra Gregory, convicted of drug smuggling in Thailand and transferred to Durham Prison in the late 1990s.
Sue is a real person. She's an honest person, she's an open person, she's a genuine person. What you see is more or less what you get. Sue went out in a pair of grey lycra shorts, as she did every single morning, hanging on to a plastic bag of brown bread to feed the sparrows. And I just thought, God, look at this batty old jailbird. And as we got out onto the exercise yard, she started going on about, I'm not guilty, I'm innocent, I didn't do the crime I was convicted of. And I thought, oh, bloody hell, here we go again. I think I'm the only guilty person within the whole prison system. And as the weeks went on and the months began to pass, I'm hearing these stories over and over and over. And after a few weeks of hearing this, I began to realise that there is something in this. Her stories are linking up. So I used to try and trick her. And I would ask her about things that I'd heard her talking about several weeks earlier. And each and every time I asked her, trying to slip her up on purpose, everything linked in, everything made sense. It didn't take long for me also to realise that this is an innocent woman in prison, serving a life sentence for a murder that she didn't commit.
Although the first appeal failed, it did succeed in bringing Susan's case to a national audience, and as a result, over 100 MPs and members of the House of Lords are now also involved in her fight for justice. And they are headed up by MP John McDonnell.
We're a group of MPs and members of the House of Lords who came together, having studied Susan's case, and felt that there was grounds here for there was a miscarriage of justice. So we came together to see if we could create a climate of opinion within government and within Parliament to seek to secure Sue's release, and then also to seek to prove her innocence.
I did have an adjournment debate in the House of Commons, which I set out the whole case, and indeed asked for the Home Office to refer the matter back to the appeal court again. It was my role to act as an intermediary with government, as an advocate with government on their behalf, and that's what I did to the best of my ability.
So just how did Susan manage to keep going and maintain the fight to clear her name?
I don't know how Sue coped with her time in prison, but on a day-to-day basis she coped in that she would be busy. She would go to education, she would go to the gym, she would always go to the chapel, and she would pray every evening, but she would write letters. And as soon as she was locked in, the box of paperwork would come out from underneath her bed, and she would sit on the edge of the bed writing letters.
It becomes all enveloping when you're a miscarriage of justice. It sort of empowers you, and it's all powerful. You know, you just, nothing else bears any significance apart from trying to clear your name.
Her cell was barren. Now there's a big difference between men and women in prison. Men tend to just do their bird. They don't titivate their cells. Women refer to their cells as rooms, and they make them into little homes. And they have doilies and pictures and cards, and they make it a very personal space. And Sue never did. I remember saying to her one day, but you know, Sue, this is so horrible. You know, can't you just put some posters on the wall or just do something to make it look a bit nicer? And she said, well, no, Sandra, because I'm not stopping. You know, I think so, but you've been here for 10 years and you've lived in these conditions for 10 years. You could make it so much nicer, but no, she wasn't stopping.
Determined to clear her name and get out of prison, Susan had to win this appeal. But the cards were stacked against her. Under British law, on preparing an appeal, you can't admit evidence which was available at the time of the first trial, except in very rare occasions. This means that because Susan's original defence team chose not to use the majority of crucial evidence, all of this evidence, which could be vital in clearing Susan's name in the second appeal, is deemed inadmissible.
The evidence that's not available to be used at appeal, because it was available at trial, is a tragedy when you've had a poor defence. Initially, when myself and my sister got involved, someone gave us a massive, great big pile of documents and we had to start reading them, and very quickly Dorothy came running round. She said, I found it. And she'd found that there was a fourth stain. All the trial was conducted on 3 stains, but there was a fourth stain that was said it was there before the murder. So that must be like these, and they must all have been there before the murder. And then you take that to the solicitors and say, I can't use it, because the solicitors could have used it at trial. And you tear your hair out.
One piece of new evidence admitted and proven in the appeal was that the original forensic expert had falsified his paperwork. This meant that the first stain containing Susan's fingerprint, which the forensic scientist said was certain to be blood, has now been discredited, and to date every credible scientific test on this stain has tested negative for blood. The second stain was just a smudge, and the police grouped it together with the first stain. The third stain was next to the light switch and was human blood, but there was no trace of Susan's fingerprint in it. It was also not individually photographed in the original forensic examination, and it is believed that the police or ambulance staff could have placed it there when examining the body and turning the light on. The original prosecution team grouped these stains together. The fourth stain was disregarded by the police because they admitted that it must have been there before the murder. It was in the kitchen and behind a radiator and was identical to stains 1 and 2. If this stain was there before the murder, then it is likely that stains 1 and 2 were also. They weren't in blood, and it is very likely that Susan, visiting her auntie up to 3 times a day every day, could have innocently put them there.
The wall with the stains on it was adjacent, or it was the passageway between the kitchen, where the food in the house was always prepared, and the dining table, where it was always eaten. The cleaner had testified that wall was well stained, and that there were stains on it that she'd tried to get off and couldn't get off.
They were originally all identified as being fingerprints in blood and referred to quite throughout as being fingerprints in blood. But I think it's generally now accepted that they're not fingerprints in blood.
But at the time of the trial, it was only the prosecution who had produced a forensic expert, and he claimed that Susan had made these stains after killing Hilda Marchbank.
The forensic evidence is curious in a number of respects, but one of the biggest curiosities and worries is the fact that some of the evidence appears to have been altered over time, and some of the evidence actually appears to have been put on documents which weren't actually created until 2 years after the event, which again is an extremely worrying thing, and I think it's a real issue for the Forensic Science Service.
At trial, Susan's best defence would have been her good character, as the judge said, and she maintains that good character to today. All that she would ever have had to do would be to say that on the morning when she found her aunt's body, that she did actually touch her face, and then turn away and put the stains on the wall. If she would only say that she remembered doing that, all of the prosecution's case would fall away.
Another piece of evidence presented to the appeal judge was how the police treated Susan with regards to her early interviews as a witness.
The way the whole interview process was done from the time that Susan was simply a witness right up until the time that she was finally charged.
I think they allowed themselves to be seduced by a strong suspect, and I think that they got trapped in tunnel vision. It's quite a common trap that all investigators fall into, and you have to work quite hard to make sure you don't.
If you're a suspect when you're being interviewed as a witness, then you don't get any of the protections that suspects get.
Susan had been interviewed purportedly as a witness but in fact was already a suspect.
Being told that you have a right to silence, being told what the evidence against you is to some extent, being told that you have the right to free legal advice. That's the difference. Sue didn't get that.
It's almost as if the officers are sort of circumventing their own systems.
Every night that Susan was incarcerated proved to be both motivating and frustrating for her appeal team.
The reason why I got involved with Susan's case in the first place, after I realised that she was innocent from looking at some of the evidence, was that I just envisaged her every night going to bed behind a locked door. The shut-in, the clang of the door as she shut in for another night. And for all the years, it was everything that I did, you would do it quickly, because it might just save her another night.
But all their efforts and hard work would prove to be fruitless. On the 7th of December 2001, Susan's second appeal was dismissed. Sandra Gregory was out of prison by then and attended the hearing.
It was horribly emotional seeing her in the courtroom. She wasn't allowed to speak. She was a long distance away from where we were sat in the court. And it seemed to go on and on and on. But of course, at the end of it, it was a deferred decision. And it seemed to happen really quickly, that we all filed into the court one morning. The judges came in and said, OK, deferred decision. And we all filed out again in a state of shock, thinking, well, what does that mean? What does deferred decision mean? I mean, are we going to find out this afternoon or tomorrow? Or it was 5 weeks. And of course, she didn't get that appeal. It's a travesty of justice, it really is.
I don't know why we lost the second appeal. I find it hard to understand. I think there are one or two things which didn't seem to come before the court, and I don't understand why they didn't.
An examination of this very detailed evidence, point by point, I think would suggest to most people that a rational person would reach a certain conclusion, namely that this case is not safe, it can no longer be justified. But for some reason, despite the fact that the evidence, the evidential base is there for anyone to look at, the judge did not reach that conclusion. I can only wonder why.
It's one of those cases that could and should have been won at trial, and the reason why it's so difficult sometimes to overturn convictions is that when the case is not really strong, those are the most, ironically, the most difficult cases to overturn on appeal.
Yes, it was devastating, and I felt ill, really, really ill. And after about 2 days, I thought, how dare those judges refuse me appeal? So in my usual fashion, I got me, because this is how I've been throughout and still am, putting pen to paper and writing letters to those that you think might listen.
You either give up or you don't give up. And if you don't give up, then you have to continue living. And there is only one thing for Sue to live for, and it's the only thing she does live for even now, and it is clearing her name and winning the next appeal and showing people that she didn't do this.
Fighting her case came naturally for Susan, but one thing she couldn't influence was the effect it was having on her immediate family. Being incarcerated meant that she missed the weddings of her 3 children and the birth of her grandchildren, along with her sister's funeral. One particularly heartbreaking event occurred during the first year of her sentence.
My mum died on the 30th of September 93. She never really, my mum knew I'd not done this, bless her, and she was horrified at what my sister had said. And from then, she was 83, but not unwell, and she went downhill from then on, because like I was close to Auntie, my mum and I were very, very close, and I was her life, just like she was mine and like Auntie was my life. The governor at Risley was very good with me, and she let me come home here with 2 officers, and I spent the afternoon on the 29th with my mum here in the front room. My mum died that night because all she kept wanting was to see me, and I think that's really what she was just waiting for.
In 2005, after 12 years in prison, Susan May is released. Released, but not cleared of murder, and remains a convicted killer in the eyes of the law.
She's one of the very few people who, whilst strenuously protesting her innocence, whilst refusing to cooperate with the prison in terms of courses designed to deal with offending behaviour, was in fact released on the first possible day that she could be released.
I was very pleased that she did finally get out of prison. I think it says a great deal for her courage and conviction that she never admitted guilt. The truth is, the prison service puts a great deal of pressure on a prisoner to admit guilt.
I'm not going to admit guilt to something I haven't done. And to be honest with you, I didn't want to be released. I always thought I'd be released via the Court of Appeal.
Obviously, she was glad to be going home to spend time with her family and friends. But equally, she was very unhappy at going home while still a convicted person, and didn't want to do anything which sent any signal that in any way she was accepting the situation.
There wasn't a victory coming out for me when she was released. She came out. It was just like the opportunity to come out. There was no victory at all. There was no celebration.
I know my mum wasn't going to be here. I knew that. But the first thing I wanted to do was walk in that front room where my mum lived, because that's where I still pictured her. And I know it's silly, but I knew she wasn't going to be, so it was a really emotional time to come to terms with everything that had happened.
It's hard for my mum. She's not getting any younger. It destroyed her confidence, destroyed everything about her going to prison. She was there for a long time. The majority of my adult life. I mean, she's only been home 2 years now.
I've struggled because I am damaged. Prison damages you. And I think it's because I'm still fighting to clear my name that fuels me.
Once you've done 4 years inside a prison, you become institutionalised. It's very difficult to overcome that. One of the ways of overcoming it is being able to demonstrate your innocence, people believing your story, and then you being able to move on. And that's what we need for Susan. Otherwise, the rest of her life, this will haunt her.
So if Susan didn't commit this horrific crime, then who did? The clues lie with the red car and the unidentified footprints and fibres found at the scene. But will it ever be proven who these belong to? This is Mr. X, the man who it is widely believed was responsible for murdering Hilda Marchbank. It is unethical to reveal his identity without a fair trial, but Mr. X will never get a fair trial because he's dead, fatally stabbed by a fellow criminal. His attacker was caught and convicted of murder, but during his trial, a conversation with a police officer revealed a chilling piece of information. Mr. X continually bragged that in 1992 he visited a house in Royton and murdered an elderly widow during a burglary, and he will never get caught for this murder because some woman is doing his time for him. It has been proven that the red car belonged to Mr. X's sister and was sold on shortly after the murder, and that other members of the criminal fraternity knew about Hilda's murder before Susan found the body that fateful morning. Susan has no choice but to continue the fight to clear her name, despite the pressure and torment it places on her everyday life, and it remains the single most important thing that keeps her going.
She still is driven by the passion of proving who killed my auntie and proving her innocence at the same time, because they're both the one and the same.
My own personal belief is that she should put a lot of it down and get her life back, but she can't. So we have to remain and support her in that.
The only thing she seems to do and the only thing she seems to talk about is the case and any recent developments and any possible developments and what she's going to do next and where she's going to go and which letters she's writing.
She said to me that she doesn't feel she's really doing anything of any importance unless she's actually working on a case.
And the main emphasis of the work now is to try and provide enough new evidence for a third appeal, which could possibly be the last chance she has to clear her name.
I want to see her name finally cleared. That's the objective, and this terrible penalty that she has suffered grievously. I don't think any of us can realise what being in prison for 12 years when you're innocent can mean.
We're just waiting for the Criminal Cases Review Commission to to feel that they've got the right case that they can put to the court.
The most important thing now, I think, is to make sure her story is told. And one of the things about this case is in telling Sue's case, it might prevent it happening to others.
I know that Sue will not find any peace and won't rest until she's cleared her name.
We are committed to walking with Susan until her conviction is quashed.
Sue will never stop fighting to clear her name.
The truth will out.
I did not murder Auntie. I'm not guilty. I will never give up my fight as long as it takes to clear my name. And I'm just appreciative of all the support that I get and the help that that's given and sustained me throughout this terrible, terrible nightmare.